Welcome to Inside Sim Racing. I'm John Sable, and today we are reviewing the EVGA GTX 970 FTW Plus graphics card. Now, there are plenty of graphic card reviews out there on the interwebs, but none of them seem to focus on sim racing titles, and as Inside Sim Racing, we don't like that very much. So we reached out to EVGA, and they graciously sent us the card to not only be part of our BAT BenQ build, but to review and benchmark on your favorite sim racing titles out there today. We benchmarked 8 sims: Assetto Corsa, Dirt Rally, F1 2015, iRacing, Project Cars, Race Room, R Factor 2, and Stock Car Extreme to see if the GTX 970 could not only power them at the traditional 1920 by 1080 resolution, but the BenQ XR3501 native resolution of 2560 by 1080 and the huge triple screen resolution of 7680 by 1080. And by power them, we mean run them at not only high frame rates, but also somewhat high graphical settings, because what's the point of going out and buying a bunch of expensive monitors if you can't take advantage of all that resolution? That's like building a McLaren F1 car and putting a Honda engine in it. But before we get to the results, let's look at the EVGA GTX 970 FTW Plus specs. It features 4GB 256-bit GDDR5 RAM, core clock of 1216 MHz with a boost clock of 1367 MHz compared to the reference 970's 1050 and 1178 respectively, 1 DVI, 1 HDMI 2.0, and most importantly, 3 DisplayPort 1.2 ports, PCI Express 3.0, a sweet-looking backplate to eliminate any sag in the card, EVGA's ACX 2.0 cooler, which will scare the hell out of you if you don't realize the fans turn off when the card is below 60 degrees C. This attractive package comes in at a tidy 10.1 inches long, so mid-tower owners fear not. All of this equals up to a price of $359.99. Now that you've been privy to the card, let's talk about the computer it's going into. The card went into my personal computer, which isn't a spring chicken. I built it back in 2011 and it still features most of the original hardware. This includes the Intel i7-2600K CPU overclocked to 4.2 GHz, MSI P67A G45 Intel motherboard, and 4 4GB Corsair Vengeance DDR3 memory sticks. I would be lying if I didn't say that the older PC didn't have some effect on the benchmarks of this card. Between the older CPU and only having PCI 2.0 and DDR3 memory, where the current generation like this card is a PCI 3.0 and most boards these days can accept DDR4 memory, this is going to have some effect. Now, is that effect going to be major? Most likely not. I just imagine that the largest effect we saw was maybe a loss of 8 to 10 frames on the DX9 titles that we tested. And to be honest, once you see the frame rates, that effect isn't that huge considering what frame rates we're running, but an older system is going to have some effects, so that is one caveat that I wanted to mention. Now, for some of you, you might have an older system, especially considering how durable the i7-2600K is, and this can give you a good idea of what you could get if you bought this card yourself. If you have a newer system, then I would say you can expect to get a little bit more frame rates, but in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty minor, and as I said, all titles were tested on this machine, so in terms of this test, everything should be equal. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the benchmarks. We benchmarked the titles in alphabetical order, and lucky enough for us, the first 3 titles in alphabetical order actually had built-in benchmarks. Those were Assetto Corsa, Dirt Rally, and F1 2015. This made testing very easy since we had a repeatable process across all resolutions. The next 5 titles, on the other hand, weren't as easy. With no built-in benchmark, it required us to recreate the same scenario at each monitor resolution. Not only did we try our best to recreate the process, we also tried to run the cars in light traffic and heavy traffic to get an idea of what effect that would have on the frame rates and get the best result. While this process isn't as accurate as the in-game benchmark, it should be close enough to give you a good sense of what the EVGA GTX 970 FTW Plus can muster in your favorite title. During the benchmark, we ran all the titles at the highest graphical settings we could without causing significant frame drops. These settings will be noted on each benchmark. Another thing we checked out was whether or not the title ran better with the NVIDIA control panel and isotropic and anti-aliasing settings or with the in-game settings. The rest of the control panel settings were left on default due to the sheer number of settings available. That information, along with whether the title is DX9 or DX11 compatible, is designated on the benchmark as well. Now that the rest of that is out of the way, let's see how each title performed. Assetto Corsa was definitely the most pleasant surprise of the benchmarking. We threw the kitchen sink at it, only leaving the overdone post-processing effects off. Everything else was maxed out, and the game and GTX 970 killed it. The 970 handled 1920 and 2560 by 1080 resolutions with no problem, and was only one of two titles that we could really recommend running the 7680 by 1080 resolution. Dirt Rally was certainly one of the harder titles on the card. With that said, it appears to run just as smoothly at 100 frames per second as it does at 144, the refresh rate of the monitors, so we were able to get away at running it at a little bit lower frame rate. The 970 does struggle to run it in triple screen with any kind of halfway decent graphics settings, although you can turn the settings down quite a bit and get it to run in the ultra-wide triples. F1 2015 experienced similar performance to its Codemasters brethren, Dirt Rally. It ran well in both single monitor resolutions, although no matter how many frame rates we had, the cockpit view always felt stuttery. All other camera angles felt fine. In ultra-wide triple setting though, the title really wasn't playable, no matter how low you turn down the graphics setting. iRacing was very difficult to test. Currently, there's a huge difference between performance of the old cars and tracks in iRacing and the latest cars and tracks, such as the Nürburgring. These new tracks are currently so hard to run that even much higher-end cars like the GTX 980 Ti are struggling to run them at points on the circuit. Knowing this, we decided to go with kind of a happy medium between old content and new content, running the McLaren MP4-12C GT3 car at Montreal. Interesting enough, iRacing was the only title in our test to run better with the anisotropic filtering and anti-aliasing settings handled by the NVIDIA control panel versus the in-game graphics setting. This resulted in about a 15 to 20 frame rate increase when running at 2560 by 1080. iRacing seems to struggle at relatively high frame rates such as 100 frames per second and really needs to be ran in the 140 plus frame range to ensure 100% smooth gameplay during a lap. With that said, the 970 was definitely able to handle the title in both single screen resolutions, and it can be run in triples as long as you turn down some of the graphical settings and avoid any of the latest and greatest tracks. Between struggling at relatively high frame rates and when around multiple cars in traffic, it's clear that DX11 cannot come soon enough to iRacing later this year. Now on to Race Room, and like iRacing, this DX9 title is difficult to benchmark. Race Room experienced huge swings between traffic and non-traffic driving, upwards of 100 frames. Interesting enough, there was not much difference between driving at 1920 by 1080 and 2560 by 1080. In ultra-wide triple 7680 by 1080, the game really wasn't playable no matter how low you turn the settings, and even though there's no triple screen rendering in Race Room. The toughest outright challenge for the 970 was Project Cars. Originally, when we started testing Project Cars, we had all the graphical settings set to high, but found that it just was not possible to run the title at those settings. So instead, we had to do a mix of medium and high settings. Luckily, the DX11 title runs smooth at relatively low frame rates and doesn't suffer from the massive frame fall off when racing in traffic, which is an attribute of being a DX11 title. Because of this, it is raceable at 7680 by 1080 if you turn down some of the eye candy. Overall, rFactor 2 ran pretty well. Had no issues running the title at 1920 and 2560 by 1080, and it was one of the best DX9 titles in terms of not tanking frame rates when in traffic. R-Factor 2 is certainly raceable with the GTX 970 in the ultra-wide triple configuration if you knock down a couple settings. True to DX9 form, Stock Car Extreme was extremely difficult to benchmark. By yourself in single screen resolution, you could run at 250 to 300 frames per second easily with all settings maxed out. But once you began a race, you would get about 75 to 80 frame rates and a crazy amount of stuttering below 110 frames per second. While we love the performance when driving solo or around a car or two, it was barely raceable when in a large pack of cars. With that said, the 970 had no issues running at all three resolutions, and if there are any issues, it's game related and not card related. So there's our benchmarks, and overall it was really interesting to see some of the patterns that came out of the testing. It was very clear that DX11 is a big step up from DX9. Not only were you able to run the titles that were DX11 compatible in lower frame rates and still have a smooth experience, but they also wouldn't tank when racing around cars like the DX9 titles would. Something else is interesting is that only one title ran better with the settings controlled in the NVIDIA control panel versus in-game, and that was iRacing. All other titles either ran the same frame rates or ran slightly better with the in-game settings enabled. As for the real star of the show, the EVGA GTX 970 FTW Plus performed very well. I would absolutely suggest it for single screen use, whether that's 1920 by 1080 or 2560 by 1080. I also think it would be a solid card for a traditional 1920 by 1080 triple setup. Some settings may need to be turned down, but it wouldn't be a tremendous step down in quality. Unsurprisingly, the card gets a little tougher to justify in triple ultra-wide setting. While it can run most of the titles here with the settings turned down, doesn't that defeat the purpose? If you're going to go buy fancy monitors, EVGA has a GTX 980 or GTX 980 Ti for you to purchase. If one of those cards struggled to run the bat, then I would knock them. But considering this is the mid-range 970, I think it did an excellent job. And one more thing before we wrap up, because I know we'll get plenty of questions. I did try to overclock the card and wasn't able to get any meaningful overclock on the card before I ran into performance issues. Since this is already overclocked, I'm happy with the settings that EVGA has, and I think they're already maxed out at a safe overclock setting. Now I'm sure some people out there can go and get a little more out of the card, but for me, I was very happy with the results and don't see a reason to overclock to get maybe a few more frame rates when we're talking frame rates already in the hundreds. With that said, I would like to thank EVGA for sending us the GTX 970 FTW Plus card to not only be part of the BAT build, but to review and benchmark on sim racing titles for you guys. As always, if you enjoyed this video, we would appreciate a thumbs up and for you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And also make sure to drop by our updated isrtv.com website to see the latest sim racing news, reviews, and join our very active forum. Also, let us know in the comments section if you want to see us do more benchmarks like this on other graphics cards. Maybe EVGA can send us a second GTX 970 for us to SLI. That'd be cool. Or maybe something a little more powerful to run the bat in the ultra-wide triples. I'm just saying. So with that, thanks for watching Inside Sim Racing. I'm John Sable. See you guys next time.